This is Spectrum's Weekly Recap, your video guide to the latest news and ideas shaping the Adventist conversation. Here are the highlights of this week. Honoring legacy and addressing tough conversations at Andrews University Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration, a call to action for religious freedom during Religious Liberty Emphasis Sabbath, the Adventist community mourns the tragic loss of Pastor William Strickland, a critical book review on the rise of Christian nationalism, and Spectrum receives the title of #1 Adventist Magazine for 2025. First up, Andrews University commemorated Martin Luther King Jr. Day with a reflective and impactful program featuring a documentary, a panel discussion, and the unveiling of a plaque honoring Bernadine Archer, the first African-American woman to earn a Master of Divinity from its theological seminary. The event highlighted Archer's trailblazing achievements while prompting deeper discussion on representation and inclusion. Through candid dialogue and a look at its history, Andrews University reaffirmed its commitment to fostering Dr. King's vision of a beloved community, challenging the broader Adventist community to confront tough questions of inclusion and representation. On January 18, a Religious Liberty Emphasis Sabbath at Pioneer Memorial Church highlighted issues of faith, freedom, and governance just as the nation inaugurated a new president. Through sermons, panel discussions, and a robust Q&A, leaders like Bill Knott, Jennifer Woods, and Shane Anderson explored themes of advocacy, religious liberty, and the church's role in societal unity. The former editor of the Adventist Review, now the church's liaison to the U.S. Congress, Knott's sermon urged proactive engagement with policymakers to protect religious freedoms, while Woods, who leads religious liberty for the Lake Union, warned against the blending of church and state seen in some legislative efforts. The event concluded with a call to action for Adventists to foster understanding, build bridges, and defend liberty in an increasingly complex and divided world. Next, the Seventh-day Adventist community in the South Pacific is mourning the tragic loss of Pastor William Strickland, whose vehicle was swept away by flooded waters in the northern New South Wales on Saturday night, January 18. Pastor Strickland, 53, had just officiated a wedding rehearsal in Lincolnwood and was leading a convoy to their accommodations when his utility vehicle was carried off a flooded causeway. After extensive search efforts involving over 170 volunteers, his body was found downstream on Monday afternoon. Described as a charismatic and loved individual, Pastor Strickland served as a pastor in Australia and New Zealand for over a decade, including roles with the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, ADRA, and Youth and Children's Ministry in South Queensland. Talia Lavin's Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, as reviewed by Trudy J. Morgan Cole, explores the rise and influence of Christian nationalism in the United States, presenting it as a pervasive and dangerous movement rooted in patriarchal, white, and exclusionary ideologies. Lavin traces the movement's evolution from its segregationist beginnings to its rebranding as a moral crusade, covering milestones like the moral majority, the Satanic Panic, and the January 6 Capitol riot. Lavin warns that if the Christian right achieves political dominance, it will impose a framework detrimental to non-Christians, immigrants, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals. Her sharp critique challenges readers, including Adventists, to examine their relationship to this movement and its fear-based faith. In its 2025 ranking, FeedSpot has named Spectrum the #1 Adventist magazine for its relevance, authority, social media following, large audience and freshness. Known for its commitment to exploring diverse views, Spectrum continues to provide insightful news, columns, spiritual reflections, Sabbath school commentary, and interviews to its readers. Across our media platforms, Spectrum recorded 4.95 million page views. Our video of the week highlights an interview titled "Chicago and the Birth of Regional Conferences," commemorating the historic 1944 vote to establish regional conferences. Produced by the Office of Regional Conference Ministries, the discussion features Elder Dona Edmond in conversation with John T. Boston, the senior pastor of Shiloh Adventist Church, along with Arthur Webb and David Graham, two local leaders from Shiloh.
We want to tell you that story. This is First Sabbath. We are in the Stevens Hotel, which is now the Chicago Hilton. And 80 years ago, a very historic meeting took place. The General Conference met here in the spring meeting, April 8 through 11, 1944. And there, the vote was taken by the delegates to authorize what we today call regional conferences. Back then they were called colored conferences. Right? I have with me Pastor John Boston, who is the senior pastor of Shiloh, Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Chicago. That was perhaps the central church as it relates to that particular, the central church in the city, the meeting place prior to the General Conference meeting. Elder Boston, please, first of all, thank you for joining us. Thank you for arranging for us to meet in this historic meeting, historic hotel, which we are in. So, Elder Boston, would you please introduce the gentleman that you have with us?
So glad to be here, Elder Edmonds. Thank you for telling this story. Elder Uncle Arthur Webb is he is a member, an elder of the Shiloh Church. He's also a clinical social worker, community organizer, and the raiser of 3 young adults that are still active and leading in the Adventist Church. And David Graham is also a minister of music at Shiloh, and he is a big brother, but he is a phenomenal gift to the body. His grandmother was here in 44 when that meeting was held in this room, and Elder Webb's mother was a young adult who passed through Shiloh and then went on to Motor City to raise a family, and he couldn't help but come back to this place.
All right, so thank you, gentlemen. Tell us, in your case, Brother Webb, tell us a little bit about your mom, who was a member of Shiloh.
That's my mom at that time, Mary Ola Slayton, is her maiden name was. I would like to say I see her as this daring, young, charming 20-year-old woman who was raised in Brightly, Michigan, which was at that point a bastion of the growing Adventist movement at that point. So she left home and came to Chicago, where in 1938 she tells me stories about her pastor. At that time, Pastor Allison. She was very fun. She said it had a lot of activities for young people. She felt comfortable. And she couldn't wait for Sabbath to roll around when they came. So I'm grateful, for that. And here I am making a reconnection to that. But as I said, my mom was a dedicated Christian. And as she grew older, she became very active in civil rights movements and other. In fact, she attended the March on Washington, D.C. with Dr. King in 1963. So she had this movement, this desire within her to stand up, and not just to stand up, but to do something about standing up when she stood up.
All right, Brother Graham, tell us about your grandmother, who was a delegate back in 1944, who in this room voted the establishment of regional conferences.
Yeah, so I have to be transparent up front. A lot of my stories come from me sitting and listening to my father and his brothers and sisters who were the children of Mary Senator Graham, and listening and eavesdropping and listening to the history and how it was established and get an idea of the atmosphere and the excitement back then. She was on the record as probably the first Bible worker for the Lay Region Conference, from what I understand. But more importantly, I remember them talking about, she was one of the laymen that established one of two evangelistic series that baptized hundreds of black people during that time, that served as the basis and constituency and the groundwork for the need for the Black Adventist movement in the Adventist Church, and later on matriculated into a pre-civil rights movement for the representation of Black Adventists in the Adventist Church. So the need predicated the need for the regional conferences. So I listened, and I can replay in my mind my father, who was the youngest of seven, playing in his mind the conversations that they listened to and they heard, and he listening to his older brothers and sisters telling him, "No, Calvin, you've got that wrong." And as far as referencing the civil rights movement, he was one of the first African Americans to be a part of the University of Louisville Surgical School, and he was down there right in the middle of the civil rights movement. He was going to school down there, so he marched with the young Jesse Jacksons and the Bobby Rushes, and while he was in med school in secret, because it wasn't a time where they were trying to matriculate African Americans. They just wanted to accept them because it came with a certain amount of funding, and the plan was not to matriculate them. So having grown up in an environment where in Chicago, downtown Chicago, where he had a mother who was raising 7 kids and pushing them and understanding the importance of having a black church supporting the Black Adventist movement in a black Christian school under a regional conference, gave them voice in this ministry that they had fallen in love with. It was extremely important. And it was the basis for everything my father did, and my aunts and uncles. It was the basis.
Shiloh is probably the only church, only African American church back there in 1944. And my understanding is that some of the meetings before the meetings happened in Shiloh. So let's talk about, let's try to share with our audience what kind of church Shiloh was. Did anybody have any idea, for example, roughly, tell us what your mother told you about what kind of church Shiloh was back in those days.
Well, like I said, it was a friendly church. Had a lot to do for her as a young woman growing up and living in the city of Chicago. And it had enough attraction for her not to be able to wait until Sabbath rolled around again. It said a lot about the safety and environment, and also about the truth of Christ, of which she always taught us about. In fact, she had a picture of Christ, and it was always hung in my mind at our front door. And it was that door, the picture of Christ, the image, where he's knocking on the door. And she would always sing that song, "Somebody's knocking on my door, sounds like Jesus, why don't you answer?" So to this day, that's still resounding to me. So it speaks a lot what was cultivated in her and in her practice and her lifestyles as a result of being in Chicago. And then also, as she matriculated to Detroit, she maintained that same fervor and stamina. So it started at Shiloh. And it certainly continued as she enjoined her membership to the Burns Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time there, but was a larger part of what was a citywide movement called the Better Living Center, which was this conglomerate of evangelism for Detroit. And she would attend those meetings every night too. So that says a lot about what was cultivated within her while she was at Shiloh.
Let's talk about the meeting itself. Your grandmother was a delegate. Yes. What do you remember her what do you remember her saying about the meeting, about the general environment, about the feelings of the membership in Shiloh relative to regional conferences?
So keeping it, all my experiences are relaying the energy after every Sabbath dinner. My family had a tradition where we had Sabbath dinner every Sabbath with family, whether it was at my aunt's and uncle's house. They all lived in one building in 3 floors, and each aunt and uncle lived on a floor, or it was at my father's house. And every Sabbath, we had dinner there. It was a place where anybody could come and eat.
Amen.
And that was harbored by a concept, to whom much is given, much is required. Mm-hmm. But my grandmother and my father and aunts and uncles did not have a whole lot. And the energy that I received, Shiloh, and that during that time, it was a hub, it was a safe space. We're talking about pre-civil rights. It was a safe space in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the ghetto of Chicago on the south side, where not just black Adventism took place, but black dreams for education, being more than just a postal worker, or being more than just what was acceptable, socially acceptable for black people in society back then, where they could dream. I remember my father and aunts talking about situations like skating parties on the gym floor that cost a penny. And then they'd have movies that cost a penny. And I remember my father talking about, they were so poor, they didn't have the money, so they would sit outside of the movie and they would act and portray what they heard. It's all coming back to me. It's a lot of it's coming back to me now.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time because I would be listening to my father and listen to them, and I'd pay attention. But the feel I got, it was energy, it was excitement, it was a safe place in a scary time where little colored kids were not accepted and not really encouraged to dream. From what I can gather, my grandma was a very independent, fearless woman. There was a time where my family lived with a family from Michigan, the Bland family, and it was 7 of them, and maybe, I'm not sure how many grandchildren, but they both shared a 2-bedroom apartment. And just, I can only imagine that all they had was their dreams. All they had was the ability to dream about what they wanted to do. So Shiloh was a hub for that. There were people that were coming from other states. I remember them saying there was, Wednesday night prayer meeting, there were meetings in that church and different houses centered around Shiloh every week, every day of the week, coming together, dreaming, saying and believing that this is what we're going to do. So I can imagine the spirit of wanting their own. Wanting their own representation, wanting to worship the way they wanted to worship under the Black Adventist movement umbrella, I can imagine fostered the need and the push for regional conferences, because that was the only way. My father really talked about, that's all he would ever talk, regional conferences. He interfaced with guys like Dudley and different ministerial guys. He was the layman, speaking very openly and cleanly in a time where it was not encouraged. So Shiloh was a hub of activity. My grandmother, I'd heard, and I heard stories about her being and reminding me of being at that meeting. I don't have a lot of memories about that, but knowing what I've heard about my grandmother, she wasn't a woman that would bite her tongue. She was a humble woman, but she didn't bite her tongue, and she was very adamant about the Black Adventist movement and the representation of Black Adventists under this umbrella that we call the Adventist Church.
Elder Boston, we'll close with you. First of all, I'm going to ask you about the hotel itself, because you are the one that arranged for us to be here. But first, we'll start off with, tell us a little bit about you, your ministry. We'll skip over the part where you turned me down when I asked you to come to South Central. We'll skip over that part. But tell us a little about your ministry.
Forgive me.
Then we'll talk
and we're
about
so grateful he did.
No, Elder Edmonds, it's hard sitting in an interview to capture all the stories, but when I listen to Elder Webb or David Graham talk, I am really clear about what they're experiencing as an outsider. 5 blocks in one direction of where Shiloh was the house of Al Capone. On State Street, it was largely owned by individuals from the Greek community. You have Mamie Till lived 9 blocks in another direction. Mahalia Jackson was singing on a corner, not even a mile away. Thomas Dorsey was playing a piano and inventing gospel music, not even a mile away. And so you're talking about a group of people that embraced an identity and said, we're going to move forward. From 1905 to 1944, they were at the Chicago Southside Church, and there was black services and there was white services. And by 1969, they had built at that time one of the largest Adventist facilities in America, and still standing today. And so I think Shiloh represents a lot of things, but one thing that it does not lack is a heritage of people that found a way to advance the 3 angels' message of Revelation 14, 6 through 12, while doing that in the armor of our culture and our voice and our identity. And so as for me, I'm just a doorkeeper at Shiloh. I try to facilitate their vision. I believe God gave them a brilliant vision. And I think that's expressed in, for us, David Graham's mother once said, we didn't just have a school of hundreds of African American children because it was a missional idea. We had to do it to survive, to protect our children. And this is what was happening in 44. And by the time you got to 45, when Lake Region came along, and 69, when the church was built, Elder Webb talks about his mother recalling their pastor would walk, one of the pastors of Shiloh at the time, you're talking about a mile from the church. Now, I don't know that I would do that without a Kevlar coated suit per se, but I certainly think that Shiloh is, when I think of Shiloh, Oakwood is our institutional church. Shiloh is our church. That is the church of Black Adventism that says we showed up when Al Capone was on the corner, and we showed up. They're trees that David's grandmother planted, and before they even built, and said, we're going to have this tree here for future generations. And I think that is what Shiloh represents. It represents a legacy of Adventism that honors culture as God speaks to us through it.
Now we're here. We've said from the beginning we wanted to tape this program from the room where the General Conference voted. So now there are other hotels around here. Why did the General Conference choose this hotel?
In 1944, while Chicago was a bastion of hope for persons moving from the South, African American persons, the Stevens Hotel, which Hilton acquired some 30, 40 years later, the Stevens Hotel was the largest facility on Lake Shore that would allow for integrated public gatherings. And so when the General Conference, which is it's not even 60 years old at this point, right? They needed a place where people of color and people that lack that level of melanin could gather in one place in a public setting. And so that's why they chose this space. These chandeliers behind us were the ones that were here in 1944. The ornate features on the walls, besides minor touch-ups, these were the walls and the fixtures that were in place in 1944. The only thing that's changed are the floors, the covering of the floors, and of course electrical for obvious reasons. And so this space is significant. While it is now known as the Hilton Chicago, it represented a groundbreaking environment for this movement.
Okay, what role from your because you're a historian,
No. He's the historian. He's the listen to my grandparents, and I'm gonna tell you the story.
No, I've spoken to you, and you have an interest in history.
Amen.
So from your study and from your discussion with your members, what have you been able to gather about the role that Shiloh played in the establishment of a Lake region?
Well, it wasn't even a month later. Once they gathered at Shiloh near Dearborn, the original gathering space, or second, Ford was the first pastor at the time, and by the time 44 came along, there was a vested interest for Shiloh to set a pace. Now, I will say, I don't want to paint a picture that our white brothers and sisters were adamantly against. The fact that they chose Stevens so that everybody could meet together was an indication that we were still close to that initial movement of fighting against segregation and fighting against oppression in this country. That was the identity of Adventism. So for Shiloh, what was unique about Shiloh is that it became a bastion of ideas about best practices to advance mission. I think the fact that the school had 417 children within its first 10 years is an indication of the level of commitment. David Graham's grandmother or family, they're in shared living quarters, but she raised doctors and pharmaceutical representatives and teachers. Elder Webb became, his mother was a young adult, and she went on to establish a family, and she's got young people that said, we're going to be educators. Now he's got kids that are educators, brilliant educators and media leaders, and David now has children. I think that was because of Shiloh. Shiloh said, we're going to preserve the future. We're going to embrace where we came from, and we are going to provide an environment where those things can be safe. Amen. The future can be safe, and the past can be remembered.
Amen.
Okay, my final question. Again, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for giving your time and sharing the story both of Shiloh and Lake Region. Pastor, my last question is, tell us, we've talked about what the Shiloh and Lake Region in the past. Tell us about Shiloh today. What are some of its strengths? What are some of its challenges?
Well, Shiloh still operates the oldest school established for children in primary school in the country, 111-year-olds that's still serving, that's still operating. And because there are much older schools and of course training schools, colleges and universities that are still older and operating, but this is still a primary school, and it's in a renaissance right now. For lots of different reasons. Some pastoral leadership, sometimes member leadership, the conference. When Shiloh sat at the table, members of Shiloh largely, to instigate the movement of Lake Region Conference, the idea was not that we just simply need to only serve black people. The idea was we need to effectively reach urban persons. And I think Shiloh is still deeply committed to that. Recently, Shiloh launched Shiloh in Espanol. You still have the school. There is, I believe, one of the largest, healthiest, most successful Sabbath morning children's ministry initiatives called Kids Camp. You have a rich heritage of music. On Sabbath morning when David lead music, or he'll ask Elder Webb, he'll say, tell Elder Webb lead the hymn. Just let him do it. So you've got the rich heritage of music. I think it's interesting. Shiloh, although gospel music was born a mile away, Shiloh has an Allen organ and not necessarily a Hammond B3, which is an indication of the broadness of the heritage of its musical identity. And even now, we're talking about opening a mental health clinic, free grocery store. We are owning half of a city block on 71st in South Michigan. And I think that the general idea is we need to do more. One of the biggest challenges we face is that there is probably a lack of understanding of what Shiloh represents. Shiloh saw more people baptized than most churches in North America over the last year. I am there because I've spent most of my ministry serving white farmers in South Africa, or indigenous persons in Australia, or people displaced in the West Indies. And I want to spend the last days that I have in ministry until Jesus comes rebuilding the African American community. It's uncomfortable to walk into a church in another country and not have people from that country in that church. And I think Shiloh needs to effectively reach the 82% African Americans in the South Side of Chicago, and effectively reach the 56% of African Americans in the city of Chicago. And I think in doing so, in the words of the current mayor, Brandon Johnson, when we experience black liberation, it affects liberation for all people. It makes a difference for everybody. We don't want the black to be guilty of doing to the brown what the white did to the black. And so we've got to figure out how to live for everybody. My hope is that soon we'll have multiple campuses across Chicago, and I'll walk away and gallop into the sunset, or Jesus will be here when Shiloh is back where it belongs as the leader in Black Adventist ministry.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your sharing this historic time, the celebration of a decision made in this room that changed the Adventist Church. And thank you for sharing your perspective.
Thank you for joining Spectrum's weekly recap. Subscribe for more stories that matter to the Adventist community, and let's keep the conversation going.